Born and raised in San Francisco, and in the 6th grade had a teacher who changed my life. But it wasn't a teacher of a traditional class. It wasn't history or science or mathematics. It was the teacher of a special elective class on Macintosh computer repair. And so I took a special elective in the 6th grade where we learned how to fix Macs, and in exchange we'd have to fix all the school's computers. And like a lot of IT people, our teacher was brilliant but very weird. For one, he denied that he had a real name. So he made us address him as Mac Doctor. And it was only upon finishing the class when he would tell us his real name, which was Ken. But we knew him as Mac Doctor. And one day the Mac Doctor showed up to school with half his head shaved and half his face shaved. So if you can imagine drawing a line down the center of your head and face, one side full beard, full head of hair, the other side all bald. And it was in the spirit of this kookiness that the Mac Doctor announced at the end of the semester that we would have a final exam, but that the final exam would have nothing to do with the material we had studied in the class. Rather, all we would have to do to get an A+ in the final would be to memorize and recite a poem. And if we could recite a poem back to him, word for word, we'd get an A+ in the class. And so 24 hours before the exam, he distributed a poem, but it turned out not to be a poem at all, but rather the text of Apple Computer's Think Different television advertisement. Who here has seen the Think Different ad? A handful of you. It ran in the late 1980s, early 1990s at Apple, and ever since having been forced to memorize that advertisement, I've not forgotten it. So I want to share it with you briefly right now. It goes like this. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. But about the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are the ones who do. And if you can imagine being 12 years old, forced to memorize that, one potential outcome is it does some psychological damage, creates some bad habits, perhaps. Another potential outcome is that it inspires the student to try to live the message, embody the message. I'd like to think that's what happened to me and some friends of mine in the class. We left that class wanting to think different, wanting to change the world. That's why I have so much respect for all of the work that you guys do. It's the power of a single teacher, a single moment, a single class can change your life, can change someone's life. And we asked the Mac Doctor after the class, how do you actually do this? How do you change the world? And he told us that one of the best ways to change the world is to start a business, to identify a problem in the world and try to build a solution. And so we went forward from that point, trying to look at our problems in middle school and junior high through the prism of entrepreneurship, trying to identify problems and actually see them as opportunities. And it launched me into a journey of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley that had lots of highs and lots of lows, and I learned so much, and I was intoxicated by the kind of gold rush of Silicon Valley at the time. But after several years of starting businesses and running software companies of my own while I was going to school, I got angsty. I wanted to leave California. I wanted to leave the US. I had never been outside of the country, and I'd never lived anywhere outside of California. And so I hired someone to run my business, and I posted a message on my blog, where I've been blogging for about 8 years now, and I said, I want to see the world. I've not been outside of the country. Who here wants to host me on their couch in exchange for a potentially interesting conversation? And the emails came in, and I ended up building this itinerary and staying with blog readers on their couch in New Delhi and Paris and Rome and Shanghai and Buenos Aires and Santiago, Chile, all over the world, learning about these people's cultures and understanding how they think and the kinds of businesses they are running and the kinds of careers they are having. What I learned through this kind of backpacking journey via blog readers experience was a lot of the people I was meeting reminded me of the very best entrepreneurs I had gotten to know in Silicon Valley. They embodied that think different idea. They may have been a musician, like the guy in Shanghai was a late night talk show band musician player, but who nevertheless was thinking very creatively about his life and how to build a life that works. Or the guy in Santiago who worked in a food services business, worked for someone else, but nevertheless struck me as very entrepreneurial, taking intelligent risk and building his network. When I came back to the States after this trip, it occurred to me that maybe this idea that I had loved so much, entrepreneurship, this identity that I had for myself, maybe entrepreneurship is more of a life idea than a business one. Maybe anyone can think like an entrepreneur. Maybe you don't have to be in Silicon Valley starting a tech business to think of yourself as an entrepreneur. And as I started noodling on this idea, I had breakfast with my co-author, Reed, and I was telling him about this burgeoning thesis. And he kind of laughed at me and said, well, you know, Ben, that's why I started LinkedIn. I started LinkedIn to be the technology platform on which every individual professional can take control of their career, establish a professional brand for themselves, and manage their career as if it were its own business. Build your network, yes, find great opportunities in the industry, pull intelligence out of the brains of the people you know. And so we discovered that we had this shared passion. We arrived at it at a different place. I, through my own personal experiences, Reed through working with hundreds of millions of LinkedIn members around the world. We were also at different points in our lives. I'm in my 20s, he's in his 40s. I felt very passionate that this was an idea that young people everywhere needed to know. He felt very passionate that all of the professionals on LinkedIn needed to have a playbook for how to make their career go. And so we decided to team up and write a book together called The Startup of You that would elaborate on this idea that entrepreneurship is more of a life philosophy than a specific descriptor of someone who starts a business. We felt compelled to do the book now because the world of work was changing around us. You know, for the last 60 or 70 years, the job market in America functioned like a well-oiled escalator. Students would go to college and get a degree, and after graduating from a college, they would pick from one of a handful of predefined career tracks, you know, finance or law or business or technology, and then go land an entry-level job at an IBM or a GE or GM or Goldman Sachs. And upon landing that entry-level job, this is how it worked for my parents and for many generations of Americans, you'd land an entry-level job, and then you'd work your way up the organizational hierarchy. And as long as you worked hard and weren't particularly unlucky, you would find yourself whisked up this escalator, slowly accumulating increased levels of competence and seniority. And maybe you'd change companies a few times, but you'd pretty much stay in this defined career track until you reach the top of the escalator and you'd step off into a company-financed pension system or government-financed social security system. And this career escalator has shaped how generations of Americans have thought about the world of work and careers. In fact, it's really the underpinning of the American dream. The American dream basically promises that every generation will have a higher standard of living than their parents had. But for my generation, it's different. For young people today, on average, we will not have a higher standard of living than our parents. And that's because that career escalator is now jammed at every level. People graduating from college can't find jobs. Youth unemployment is at its highest level since World War II. And folks in the middle of their careers, you know, your alumni, 10 to 15 years after graduating, are increasingly stuck in a kind of promotionless limbo. And folks later in their careers, your older alumni, are finding themselves having to reinvent themselves and acquire new skills late in life, with their retirement system blown up or the company pension no longer functioning. And so this entire escalator has been jammed, and now we find ourselves each kind of piloting our own boat in a vast ocean waters with the waves crashing around us and no fixed destination and constantly having to be entrepreneurial and adaptive. What's interesting is that the macro forces that have structurally rechanged the American economy and the labor market, the changes of globalization and technology that are automating jobs and offshoring jobs, those same tectonic forces are what entrepreneurs face when starting businesses. They've always faced these things. Anyone who started a business knows that when you found a company, you do so amidst conditions of great change and uncertainty and competition. You're constantly having to adapt yourself in order to survive, let alone thrive. And those are the conditions we all now face ourselves in. And every college graduate in America today will face upon graduation. And so Reed and I thought it was very important to capture the universal wisdom of what entrepreneurs do to deal with those kinds of conditions and apply those principles to a broad set of life contexts. So even if you want to be a doctor after college or a lawyer or an educator or a journalist, you can still behave entrepreneurially. You can still be the CEO of your own career, the entrepreneur of your own life. by deploying the strategies of the very best Silicon Valley startup entrepreneurs. And that's the premise of the Startup Review. And I want to take a minute and give you a little more depth on what actually comprises that playbook, and then I'd love to hear your questions. There are two components to what it means to be the entrepreneur of your own life. There's a mindset, and there's a set of skills. And the mindset is what we call permanent beta. I gave a talk at the University of Kentucky a couple months ago, and when I showed up, the auditorium was filled with students that had a blue t-shirt that said, "I'm in permanent beta." It was a very cute thing to see. All the students had read the book. They were wearing a t-shirt that said, "I'm in permanent beta." Now, what does that mean? Beta is a word from the software industry that refers, as many of you know, to software that's not quite ready for prime time, software that has bugs, right? Software that is still subject to internal testing. At least that's what it's meant for a long time. But in 2004, Google forced all of us to rethink the word beta when they shipped Gmail as a fully functioning email product with millions of users and tens of millions of emails, and yet still had the product officially in beta. And there was this whole debate in Silicon Valley about what Google was doing. Why are they misleading people to think that Gmail's actually in beta when clearly it works? But Larry Page and the Google team had a very clear philosophy. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were signaling to both employees and to users that a product is never finished. That for entrepreneurs, finished is an F word. That the moment you think of a product as shipped into market is the moment a competitor surpasses you. And that there's always things that can be done to make Gmail better. We think this is an excellent philosophy for all of us to have in our lives. I often cite Ben Franklin, who I think is one of America's great entrepreneurs. Ben Franklin wrote that when he woke up in the morning, he often asked himself, will I go to bed tonight smarter than I am right now? Imagine asking yourself that question. You wake up in the morning, get out of bed, and you say, will I go to bed tonight smarter than I am right now? It's an intense question, but I think it embodies this idea of permanent beta. And I think every student in America today needs to embrace this idea that I'm in beta. That, yeah, I have some flaws, I have things I can work on, but I have the power to improve myself, to work with my network and the people around me to become better, to be more competitive, to acquire the skills that matter. That's the entrepreneurial mindset that we elaborate in the book in a universal context. Then there is a set of skills and strategies that entrepreneurs employ that we detail. So I'll give you a couple examples. A classic question that entrepreneurs ask themselves is, what kind of business do I want to start? Where is the market opportunity? A classic question that every freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior in college ask themselves is, what do I want to do with my life? Right? What do I want my career to be? What am I working towards? And it turns out that entrepreneurs have a very specific way of thinking about that question. And that we map that question to a broader life context by encouraging every individual to think about the notion of how they're going to build a competitive advantage in the economy. By not just asking themselves what they're passionate about, not just asking themselves what their strengths are, and not just doing what Tiger Mom philosophy suggests, which is just focus on where there's a market opportunity, but by thinking about all of your assets and thinking about your aspirations and thinking about the market realities and looking at the intersection of those things to truly find your sweet spot in terms of a career. We talk in the book about building networks. How do entrepreneurs form teams to accomplish great things? And how can each of us, starting when we're in school, surround ourselves with people who help us grow? I was telling someone last night at dinner that one of the cool things in publishing today is that the Kindle, Amazon shows you which sentences in the book are the most highlighted. It's this kind of phenomenal reader feedback interaction thing. And the most highlighted sentence in our book by far, which kind of I wasn't expecting, is a sentence that says, the fastest way to become the person you want to be is to surround yourself with people who are already that way. There's a shorthand way of thinking about this, which is you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around. Entrepreneurs obsess about their network, who's on their team, and they build a company around them to do that. And we think every individual needs to think that way. Who's on your team? You're the CEO of You Inc. Who's on your team? And finally, I'll give you one final example. We talk about risk. We talk about how entrepreneurs take risk, how they don't just bet the farm on a random business idea, but rather are very prudent about finding great opportunities with an appropriate amount of risk associated with it. And we tell every individual professional, including every young person, that you're going to have to take some risks in your life. But here's a framework for thinking about how to do it. All right, I want to close with a quote from Muhammad Yunus. Who here knows who Muhammad Yunus is? So Muhammad Yunus is a microfinance pioneer from Bangladesh, won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. And Yunus said, this is just a few years ago, all humans were born entrepreneurs. In the caves, we were all self-employed, finding food, feeding ourselves. That's how human civilization began. But as civilization came, we suppressed that instinct. We became labor because they stamped us, you are labor. And we forgot that we are entrepreneurs. And I would add, the startup is you. Thank you very much.